For as long as we've gazed up at the night sky and marveled at the regular and predictable movement of the stars, humanity has at the same time been stuck fast in the chaos unfolding on Earth, leaving us in the grips of a profound contradiction. We observe the mathematical precision of nature, we worship gods we believe dispense justice, and we hold each other to standards of goodness we believe must be woven into reality itself. And yet we live in the midst of at times unimaginable suffering and disorder, which seems as much a part of the world around us as the order and goodness we so stubbornly cling to. The greatest minds the world has ever known have struggled with this tension for millennia, developing sophisticated and powerful philosophical and religious systems to explain how to reconcile our deep sense of cosmic order with the overwhelming chaos and suffering that surrounds us. You might recognize this as the problem of evil, a staple in philosophy classrooms all over the world, which asks how an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God could allow for so much evil and suffering to exist. But this modern, Western, and uniquely Christian formulation is merely the latest chapter in a 3,000-year intellectual journey, at least partly responsible for some of the most enduring ideas in all of Western civilization. In fact, the problem of evil, as philosophers know it today, is really just a relic of the spectacular failure of the Christian solution to the problem of evil that dominated Europe throughout the Middle Ages, going all the way back to Augustine in the 4th century AD. Today we'll explore the real problem of evil throughout its long history, and see how various attempts to solve it have fundamentally shaped our understanding of the universe, divinity, and our place in the world for millennia. So in order to understand the problem of evil as we know it today, we have to go back in time to some of its earliest solutions that we have access to. We'll begin in ancient Egypt, which proposed a duality between order on the one hand, symbolized by the term Ma'at, and chaos, or Isfet, on the other. The idea was that the suffering and evil manifested in Isfet was constantly trying to disrupt the order of Ma'at. This fundamental duality was personified by various different deities, with Ra, the sun god, on the side of good, and Apep, or Afof, on the side of darkness and disorder. Human suffering is seen as the result of this cosmic struggle, when Isfet gains the upper hand. Another ancient solution to the problem of evil is Zoroastrianism, which came from ancient Persia. Zoroastrianism similarly held a dualistic worldview. On the side of good was Ahura Mazda, while on the side of evil was Ongra Mainyu. And this cosmic battle between these two opposing forces played out in the form of human choices. Those who chose well supported Ahura Mazda, while those who chose wickedness supported Ongra Mainyu. So both the ancient Egyptians and Zoroastrianism explains evil as an independent force constantly in opposition to the forces of good or order. Another ancient source of insight on the problem of evil comes from the Old Testament, specifically the book of Job. In the book, the main character Job suffers immensely at the hands of God. Several characters in the story, Job himself included, believe that his suffering must be the result of some transgression of his against God. But as the story goes on, it seems like Job's punishment makes less and less sense. He is a righteous man, after all. And when God finally gives the answer, it's a bit unclear. On the one hand, it seems like God is just testing Job's faith. But on the other hand, when he's speaking to Job, he says something to the effect that we don't really have a right to understand God's decision-making. We aren't owed an explanation of why God treats us the way that he does. If God wants to test us in whatever way he sees fit, we kind of just have to deal with it. Now, this isn't a conclusive answer, as I said, but it does rule out the idea that the universe is just and God only rewards the good and punishes the wicked. God just doesn't work that way, according to the Jewish tradition. Each of these three traditions had enormous influence in the ancient world, and they each explained evil in a way that worked within the confines of their own tradition. But eventually the Greek philosopher Plato arrived and changed everything from then on regarding the problem of evil in Western civilization. Plato reframed the entire problem and offered his own metaphysical explanation of where evil comes from. Plato believed that the physical world was just an imperfect copy of the divine or transcendent realm of the forms, or ideas. This is because the world was created by a mythological being known as the craftsman or the demiurge, who did his best to arrange things in the way that reflected the perfect and transcendent realm of ideas, but the material that he had to work with was inherently limited, and his work was inherently imperfect. And this imperfection is what explains the evil in the world, according to Plato. So unlike the Egyptians or Zoroastrianism, where evil is a separate force, for Plato, evil is merely a privation of good. It's a failure to live up to the ideal goodness that exists in the transcendent realm of the forms. Evil is built into the world as a limitation of how good it can possibly be. And this metaphysical system went on to influence much of the ancient world from Plato's point onward, developing into a sophisticated system that persisted well into the Hellenistic period, called Platonism and eventually Neoplatonism. And it also went on to influence Christianity. So Christianity inherited a lot of Platonic metaphysics, including the idea of a perfect transcendent realm and an imperfect material world. In fact, some philosophers like to even say that the Christian God is just the personification of Plato's idea of the form of the good. And the figure of Jesus Christ is the form of the good incarnate, walking among humankind for the brief period of time he was here. He was a perfect being living among the imperfect creation that we all find ourselves in. Now, for as compelling as Christianity was to its early practitioners, it did create a couple serious tensions for this Platonic metaphysics. On the one hand, how are we supposed to interpret the relationship between the divine and transcendent realm of the forms and the imperfect fallen world of creation? And on the other hand, you have the question of where Jesus fits into this Platonic metaphysics, because he seems to provide a bridge from one to the other, but the details are tricky. And these two tensions would become major focal points of early Christian traditions that would later on become heretical. Consider Arianism, for example, associated with Arius of Alexandria from the 3rd century. Arianism held that Jesus was created by God, but he was not himself God. He was not divine. He was a man, a creation of God himself. But the reason they denied the divinity of Jesus was to preserve the integrity of the Platonic system. It's simply logically and metaphysically impossible for God himself, the transcendent, divine, perfect being, to live among us who inhabit this imperfect world. So this approach worked pretty well in preserving Platonic metaphysics and early Christian doctrine. But eventually the Church rejected it and declared Arianism a heresy in order to preserve the divinity of Jesus Christ. So Jesus must have been divine, and we just sort of have to figure out a way to explain how that works. Another potential solution that was also deemed heretical was found in Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a spiritual, religious, mystical combination of early Christian ideas and Neoplatonism. The Gnostics believed that the physical world was actually a prison, preventing us from divine illumination or gnosis, wisdom. And the figure of Jesus Christ was a way of escaping this material realm. He came down to reveal his wisdom to us, and in turn gave us the ability to break free of these shackles of the imperfect world that surrounds us. They even equated the Platonic demiurge with the God of the Old Testament, and believed that this God was fundamentally different from the true God known as the Pleroma, or the fullness, the transcendent God of the divine realm. One particularly well-organized early Christian sect, heavily influenced by Gnosticism, was Marcionism, associated with Marcion of Sinope. Marcion was deeply influenced by Gnostic thinking by believing that the God of Christianity was alien to this world. And he also held, like the Gnostics, that Jesus was a messenger, a ticket out of this material world that shackles us, and into the transcendent realm of goodness and divinity. But he believed that the form that Jesus ultimately took was non-physical. Jesus didn't actually take human form, he only appeared to. And this move also preserves the Platonic metaphysics by denying that Jesus ever walked among us, that Jesus ever physically inhabited the imperfect material world. So this preserved Jesus' divinity and connection to the transcendent realm without having to deal with the question of how he could have possibly physically materialized among us, because he didn't. Now, the common thread in all of these heresies is that they tried their best to preserve the Platonic metaphysics. Specifically, they tried to preserve the Platonic solution to the problem of evil. They tried to explain evil as an inherent feature of the physical world that we inhabit, and they left perfection and goodness in a divine and transcendent realm that we couldn't really access. The figure of Jesus served as a bridge. But in order to salvage that figure, we had to either make Jesus more God than man, as the Gnostics did, or more man than God, as the Arians did. But the early church fathers that went on to establish the foundational doctrines of Christianity weren't having any of it. They needed to find a way to preserve the divinity of Jesus Christ, to unify the God of the Old and New Testament, and to explain evil in the world all at once. In other words, they needed a new metaphysics. They needed to give up the Platonic answer to the problem of evil and find a new one. Enter St. Augustine of Hippo, a 4th century theologian responsible for many of the founding doctrines of the Catholic faith. But it took him a really long time to get there. When he was younger, he was heavily influenced by a school of thought called Manichaeism. And Manichaeism was heavily influenced by Gnosticism. It accepted the Platonic metaphysics of a divine, transcendent realm as opposed to an imperfect, physical realm. But throughout the process of his conversion to Christianity, he eventually abandoned Manichaeism and forged the Catholic Orthodoxy. His eventual problem with Manichaeism and the Platonic solution to the problem of evil was that the dualism between the divine and transcendent realm and the physical realm was just too strong. In the book of Genesis, God deems his creation good, so it can't be the case that the world we inhabit is inherently flawed. And the God who created this world must himself be good too, and there is only one God, so it all has to go together somehow. And Jesus must be God incarnate because he says so in the New Testament. So the physical world can't be inherently evil, and Jesus must be divine. So Augustine needed a new solution to the problem of evil. And his solution consists of 2 major moves. The first is actually influenced by Platonism, which is to redefine evil simply as a privation of good, or the absence of goodness. Like darkness is the absence of light, evil is just the absence of goodness. So evil actually has no positive existence. And this move avoids making God responsible for evil. God did not create evil because God is perfectly good. And so evil is really just a failure to live up to the goodness of God. But the question still remains, where does that come from? How is it possible that God's creation, which is good, can still contain evil and imperfection? And the answer is free will. God gave humans free will. God gave human beings the ability to turn away from his goodness. And we did so almost instantly in the Garden of Eden. Evil occurs when we turn away from what is truly good towards a lesser good. And suffering is simply the result of human choices and their consequences. So according to Augustine, all the imperfection that we see in the world is really our own fault. The world is messed up because we have been misusing our divine gift, and consistently choose to turn away from God when we should be turning towards him. And this theory traces all evil back to the fall of man and original sin. And Augustine's solution kinda worked. It became the Catholic Orthodoxy, and it satisfied most philosophers and theologians throughout the Middle Ages. But eventually, Augustine's solution was called into question. The Renaissance and Reformation ultimately undermined the authority of Catholic Orthodoxy, including its answer to the problem of evil. Additionally, other major events would erode the authority of the teachings of the Catholic Church, like the Crusades, various wars of religion, and the spread of Islam in historically Christian lands. Eventually, it just seemed like there was too much evil that could be reasonably explained by appealing to the misuse of human freedom. And this finally brings us to the modern problem of evil as we all know and love it. Namely, the idea that a God that is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent cannot coexist alongside the amount of evil and suffering in the world. Either we're wrong about our conception of God, God doesn't exist, or we're wrong about all the evil that we see around us. And the inability to solve this version of the problem of evil is one of the hallmarks of the modern period. It's one of the unambiguous symptoms of the radical breakdown of the Christian worldview that dominated the Middle Ages. Reformers like Martin Luther, defenders like Leibniz, and absconders like Voltaire all sought new ways of understanding the world once it was clear that Augustine's solution no longer worked. And, well, the rest is history. So the problem of evil runs pretty deep. It's that universally human attempt to reconcile the idea of an orderly, just, and good universe with the imperfect, wicked chaos that we find ourselves in. And while the contemporary problem of evil that you might see in a philosophy textbook is definitely a response to a specific moment in history, the sentiment behind the problem, the real problem of evil, is as old as humanity itself. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe for more Frank Philosophy.